Right, hello guys. So today we're just going to do some component 3 psychology. We're going to start off backwards, I suppose. We're going to do controversies because, to be fair, it was the easiest one to do. I just had to copy and paste it into the PowerPoint. So yeah, so I will say controversies. So we're going to start with the ethical costs of controversies. We, I will stress this. Do not copy my answers word for word. You'll have the same material and you'll have the same evidence. You might not have the same points exactly, but don't copy it word for word. Obviously, learn to create your own writing style, your own paragraphs, like how you write your own paragraphs. Because forget the assessment, but it furthers your own learning anyway, your writing capabilities, and plus you'll get put down for plagiarism if it's found out that you've copied an answer. So this is what I wrote in my exam, or close to what I would have wrote, because obviously it would have been one out of these four. So the other three I wouldn't have written. So cool. So ethical costs in psychological research refers to the ways that psychological research may affect the rights or health of its participants. Techniques to mitigate the risks of risk management and benefits or negative consequences to society and the economy. These can include deception, protection from psychological or physiological harm to participants. But in your exam, try not to abbreviate, or if you're going to abbreviate it, write participants and then put PPS in brackets afterwards. So a right to withdrawal, privacy or privacy, fully informed consent and confidentiality. Ethical guidelines state that participants should experience no greater harm than they would with an ordinary encounter with the stimulus or in everyday life. They should leave the research in the same psychological state that they entered. For instance, the participant in Watson and Rayner's study left the psychological research with an unresolved psychological trauma that persisted over a year afterwards. So you would say that in that case, it wasn't ethical. So, benefits to society and the economy. Despite this, clear benefits to society that psychological research contributes towards affords the ethical costs of research. Whilst Watson and Rayner's Little Albert study subjected the participant to intense psychological distress, it highlighted the environmentally deterministic nature of behavior. This has paved the way for multiple effective exposure therapies, such as systematic desensitization, flooding, and aversion therapy, to be implemented to counter condition phobias. This is a positive benefit to society as it means that less individuals will suffer from distressing stimuli, which may improve economic function as there will be more workers pursuing otherwise avoided jobs due to fear, such as being a pilot, for instance. Benefits to society may include life expectancy as well, because studies show that minute or minuscule amounts of stress that accumulate throughout the day are actually more impactful than major life events, which suggests that if you have a phobia of something, if you're consistently exposed to stress more than the average person, the elevated level of cortisol over time may actually reduce your lifespan. So if the life expectancy of society goes up because of this, then it's a benefit to society. So evaluation for this, positive of it. So implementation of conditioning techniques in schools, for example. So McAllister et al. Study with classical conditioning, so associating praise with better learning environment / happiness. Or Loftus and Palmer, revolutionizing criminal justice system. Leading questions are prohibited when examining in chief in courtrooms. And it documents the effects of interrogation techniques, not necessarily documents, but it means that we can infer whether some interrogation techniques should be used or shouldn't be used, etc., or the effects of them on the human mind. So even in creating more interrogation techniques, so Rain's implementation of brain scans, so PET scans to determine brain function, which substantiated the assumption of localization of brain functions plus behaviors, understanding complex phenomena, so behaviors as a societal, so therefore scientific benefit, preventative measures, etc. So James Fallon versus Bradley Waldrop. So this essentially, this comparison is reflects two people who both had brains of a quote unquote psychopath. So if you recall your Rain et al. Study in component 1, classic research, the psychopath brain, they both had that, but James Fallon was an innocent man and didn't commit any crimes throughout his life. However, Bradley Waldrop was a criminal. So it demonstrates that with certain social or sociological interventions, the prevention of criminal behavior, even if you are biologically predetermined to conduct such behavior, it can be stopped or it can be prevented. But that understanding is merit to Rain et al. Study of brain scans or brain glucose metabolism in criminals convicted who are pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. So However, there are numerous instances where there are potentially negative consequences to society, such as the reinforcement of stigma against specific demographics that do not afford the ethical costs of psychological research. Bowlby's 1953 study into maternal deprivation highlighted the importance of parenting. However, it may have reinforced stigma against workers with disobedient neurodivergent children. It may have added additional societal pressure and stigma for mothers to produce societally functioning children when many factors are out of their control. So, refrigerator mother explanation, Canon 1940, plus Battleheim's The Empty Fortress, describes ASD as a genuine belief a child should not exist. So if you then have a society that thinks that a child having ASD is because of inadequate socialization by the mother, right, or neglect from the mother, that is a negative consequence. That's a negative consequence to society, because it means not only is it a falsehood, but it predisposes members of society, so women, to harm. So, evaluation, I'd say this is a strong argument. Studies such as Rain et al. May have contributed to stigma against people who exhibit behaviours like those with the same brain scans as NGRI, so not guilty by reason of insanity, for homicide. So, additionally, the unregulated use of such information from studies may pose a risk, as organisations such as the government can use it for unrestricted access or means. Or, Loftus and Palmer, the use of leading questions to distort memory suggests that the phrasing of sentences can have significant psychological effects. So you can argue that this is unethical. So unethical interrogation techniques may be developed because of this. So that's a negative consequence to society. It's essentially just these studies are unregulated, their conclusions are unregulated, therefore the knowledge may, in the wrong hands, be very harmful. Or, for example, so the application of psychological study into sensory deprivation was used in psyops for military torture. So that's a tangible example there. So, cost to the individual. However, scientific ethical costs to individual participants are generated in conducting psychological research. Watson and Rayner's Little Albert study caused them to develop coping mechanisms for trauma, such as thumb sucking. Furthermore, Milgram's study incited major psychological distress to individuals and resulted in physical harm, which is a major ethical cost. This is because 3 individuals suffered such severe seizures that the experiment was required to be halted. 14 other participants experienced great nervousness. This suggests, therefore, and you do it yourself. So you can shorten that down and mention Aronson and Baumride. To be honest with you, I have absolutely no clue what that study is, but I'm sure if you Google it, you'll be able to find it. So, risk management techniques. However, the risk management techniques sought out by Milgram negated the ethical cost of the research to the individual. The process of debriefing and offering counselling to clients allowed them to return to the same psychological state as before the research. Further, polls suggested that they even benefited, meaning they're in a better psychological state than previously due to the new acquired knowledge or new insight into their own behaviours. So, moreover, discussion with his professors and students prior caused them to presume presumptive consent that there would be no psychological harm, as they predicted that 0.3 participants would go up to 350 watts. Therefore, no harm, as it was at this point that the participants started complaining. Furthermore, the presence of the ethical committee is a risk management technique that reduces ethical costs. If it is likely to be ethically sound, then they will approve, says Zimbardo, predicted that prisoners would riot and cause problems rather than a tyrannical reign. So the assumption is essentially the reality for them was that the harm couldn't even have surfaced because it wouldn't have gotten to that point. However, obviously the actual results of the experiments spoke for themselves. So culture bias next, so 1 out of 4 there. Culture refers to the rules, customs or morals and ways of interacting that bind together members of society or a collection of people. Culture bias refers to the tendency of people to make assumptions about the behaviour of others based on their own cultural norms or practices. This can be disadvantageous in cross-cultural studies, as it may impede the validity of conclusions or methodologies. For example, the presence of beta bias in a study may mean that the standard of measure used may reap inconsistent or unrepresentative results. So, cross-cultural studies allow for psychologists to make broader implications about complex phenomena in behaviour, such as moral development or happiness. For example, Kohlberg's study into moral development and Meyer and Diener's literature review into happiness allows for a scientific view of psychological phenomena across cultures. However, there is an apparent lack of these cross-cultural studies, as in a standard British psychology textbook, or psychological textbook, 66% of research was American, 32% was European, and less than 2% was from other countries, like Smith and Bond. This is an issue as it means that the predominant understanding of psychology is from a Western perspective, which is unrepresentative of global psychological behaviour. This may also suggest that psychological research suffers from ethnocentrism, being the use of our own ethnic or cultural groups as a basic for the judgment of other groups. So essentially, the relationship between psychological expression and sociological influence may be so linked together that that you cannot apply psychological expressions in Western society, those of Eastern societies or tribal societies, for example. This is because their sociology is different, so they'll act different, they'll think differently, their brains may work differently. Obviously, the organ is the same, but because of its adaptive ability, it's wrong to assume that the standards of, or it's scientifically inaccurate to assume that the Western standards of psychology can be applied globally, because that's not necessarily the case. So, ethnocentrism in research may suggest that culture bias is present due to beta bias, thus damaging the external validity of studies and the applicability of such. For example, social implications of Milgram's study on obedience proposes that the mechanics of obedience is identical across all cultures, which may not necessarily be true. This means that and you do it yourself. So whether this is a difference between cultures or a bias is highlighted by Hofstede. Individualist cultures emphasize self-interest and immediate family, with personal autonomy and achievements being prioritized. However, collectivist cultures emphasize loyalty to the group and interdependence on each other. This means that differences in results between this means that differences This means that there will be differences in results between cultures. Sorry for the bad English. So, for example, Myers and Dina's study measured subjective well-being. However, this may vary depending on individualistic and collectivist cultures. Therefore, conclusions as to the difference between cultures may be because beta bias rather than genuine difference. The solution to such would be the application of an imposed ethic on psychological research. The historical or social context behind research is additionally important to consider, as the applicability of such research may differ depending on when it was conducted and the participants used. Sears found that 82% of psychology research used undergraduates as participants, 51% being psychology undergraduates. This is an issue as beliefs and opinions may only be relative to those subcultures, so being students. Loftus and Palmer used students, for instance. So the use of non-human animals, I will warn you, for the last controversy, I didn't get to finish it when I was revising, and if I'm really honest with you, I cannot be bothered to finish it. So you'll have to include your inputs on that one, but you should be fine, to be honest. There is a relatively substantial amount of work or written pieces there. So non-human animals. So the issue with using non-human animals in psychological research is that there may be conflict behind larger societal interest and potential harm to animals. Moreover, there is contention as to whether this has relevance to psychologists in the first place. Implementation of the 3 R's into psychological research behind the replacement of animals wherever possible, the reduction of the use of animals to the bare minimum, and the refinement of psychological procedures to reduce suffering, that's Russell and Birch, is required as to the guidelines of the British Psychological Guidelines. The BPS requires that animals are treated with their past experience contextualized, and that responsibility extends to the care of animals when not being studied, including the provision of companions for social animals. For instance, if one is studying wolves or dogs or monkey breeds such as chimps or gorillas, then you would provide a social space for them by providing more of these animals, because, for example, wolves and dogs are pack animals, and monkey breeds often operate within families as well. So there are multiple barriers to ensure that ethical psychological research into animal testing is performed, such as legislation. This protects animals as it ensures only that the most necessary psychological research which causes distress to animals is performed. This overall reduces the net suffering of animals in psychological research, strengthened by the presence of the 3 conditions that must be fulfilled for licensed researchers to grant the permit to such research. Another barrier present is the Benson Cube, a 3-dimensional evaluation of the effectiveness and ethics of psychological research involving animal testing. This protects animals as it means that there is a rigorous evaluation of the study before it performs, ensuring that the ratio between the potential distress of animals versus the scientific and societal benefits are maximized favorably. Some psychologists may argue that the solution to preventing the suffering of animals in psychological research is to prevent all suffering. This would be the complete ban of animals testing. Except for legislation, there are merely guidelines which researchers do not have to respect in practicality. This is supported by Donaire, 2002, who suggested that the implantation of limitations rather than an outright ban is synonymous with the codified norms and regulations or legislation, of black enslavement in America. Legality and morality are different. Therefore, simply making it legal or illegal does not make it correct or incorrect. Moreover, this comes with the assumption that humans are superior to non-human animals, which is not the case and depends on belief system, which is more of an subjectivity rather than an objectivity. And obviously, science, the aim of psychology is to be as close to a science as possible, and science would be regarded as the closest thing to being objective rather than subjective, whilst still maintaining an air of skepticism. So, animals as a therapeutic device has been demonstrated by the presence of pets to reduce stress. For example, Allen 2003 reported that the presence of pets reduced blood pressure in children reading aloud, buffered the elderly against life event stresses, and reduced cardiovascular risk. A different kind of therapeutic approach aims to enable disturbed or socially isolated individuals to learn how to trust and form relationships with other people, so form attachments. Animal-assisted therapy may include the use of dogs, cats, horses, dolphins, or even fish and hamsters as behavioral facilitators. However, other researchers criticize such studies. Anestis et al. Reviewed 14 studies of equine therapy and identified several serious methodological issues. Sample sizes are very small, no control groups are present, and individuals were not randomly assigned to control groups. Any benefits may simply be due to having special attention from the therapist rather than therapies in general. That is the therapist-client relationship that is key, rather than having any kind of intervention. Speciesism is the concept that being human is a good enough reason for human animals to have greater moral rights than non-human animals. Peter Singer refers it to a prejudice or bias in the favour of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of another species. In the same stroke, Singer argued that discrimination in this nature is no different from racial or gender discrimination. However, Gray suggested that we have a special duty of care to humans, and therefore speciesism is not equivalent to, for instance, racism. Therefore, it makes racism exponentially more worse than speciesism. A utilitarian suggestion would argue for the greater good. Having rights as an individual or collective is dependent on having responsibilities, but animals do not have any. You can counter this by stating that ecological responsibilities such as the maintenance of ecosystems count. So that's a kind of like a evaluation point. You could say that having rights as an individual, as humans, we have responsibilities to upkeep the planet, and therefore we have rights, right? So, but you could counter this by saying insects such as bees, spiders maintain ecosystems. Animals in general contribute to the maintenance of the ecosystem, which technically you could count as a responsibility if you were to go down this route of argument as just like a small evaluation point. So, and then afterwards, you should do your own conclusion. Although, yeah. So just use like the skeleton of these points, same evidence, but you can make your own arguments, whatever. And now it's the scientific status of psychology. To be scientific refers to the attainment of knowledge based on systematic and objective methods of data collection that can be replicated to demonstrate the validity or reliability of results. This includes falsifiable evidence, standardized procedures, objective standards of measure, and a random allocation of participants. The scientific status of psychology has developed profoundly in contemporary society. For instance, the expansion of schizophrenic explanations to biological explanations such as the dopamine hypothesis and amygdala dysfunction. Amygdala dysfunction in psychopathy and autism. So if you look at some symptoms of autism, they actually cross-reference with psychopathy. Things like this is mainly intuitive thought. So I would verify this with not what I'm about to say is intuitive thought. What I've just said is fact. But I would believe that things like a lack of empathy or certain social deficits, for instance, in psychopathy, are correlated or have been established to can be caused by amygdala dysfunction. So this is due to the implementation of modern scientific methods such as brain scans as objective standards of measure to provide scientific evidence. So the changing nature of science has numerous benefits to society, as people will need to verify their claims. This is demonstrated in multiple areas of psychology, such as the refinement of explanations of autism from the refrigerator mother explanation, Kanner, and the empty fortress, Bettelheim, to scientific explanations such as amygdala dysfunction and family studies that utilizes verifiable knowledge rather than armchair psychology in quotation marks that cannot be falsified. So things like Freud's explanation, for instance. However, the over-reliance of evidence and scientific authority, I should say, may cause negative societal shifts in attitudes where an incorrect scientific conclusion has been made. For instance, Bowlby's study into maternal deprivation with the 44 thieves was deemed to be scientific relative to the time period and thus likely contributed to the stigma against mothers. The first change refers to the type of behavior being studied. Previously, only pathology of psychological disease was studied. However, areas such as mindfulness and positivist psychology are explored. The second change are the methods used, creating options between nomothetic and ideographic methods. This expansion allows for greater methods to measure qualitative data, such as thematic analysis in literature reviews, such as Meyer and Dina's research, or their literature review, for instance. However, the disadvantage, you could say, the attainment of qualitative data may impair the objective stature of results. So Bowlby, as he used case studies, and they came to a provisional diagnosis. So because it was a provisional diagnosis, it wasn't actually a mental illness. So that means that it wasn't standardized. The symptoms weren't standardized and were based on his own intuition, which may have been impacted by bias. So affectionless psychopathy, while psychopathy is a diagnosable mental illness, affectionless psychopathy isn't necessarily. Cool. So the good thing about component 3 is that aside from some extra cases, there's a couple extra cases, but for the most part, it's what you've already learned. So non-human animals, yes, that's mainly things you haven't learned in psychology. But for the most part, even if you haven't revised this at all, if you were to get a question, you could do decently just based on the knowledge you already have. You just have to have more of like a global processing. You have to be able to draw information from different sides and different psychological areas. Component 1, classic research, assumptions, maybe even component 3, let's say. So for things like, for instance, nomothetic idiographic methods, or qualitative data, or being able to establish whether something is an objective standard of measure or not, things like that. But yeah, for the most part, controversies is relatively simple. I think it's a nice break from the rest of it, to be honest. But component 3 is decent anyway, but it's just a lot. It's far more than component 1 in my opinion anyway. Component 2 is quite simple. If you just go with obviously revise on your own, things like graphical representation I didn't cover in my video, but generally speaking, you can kind of use your intuition from GCSE maths for that. But even if you didn't do so well in GCSE maths, you in your lessons you will cover that like potential gap in knowledge. So you can really just use what you've already learned in component 3 controversies. Obviously the rest of it, so schizophrenia, autism, or I don't know if you're doing criminal behavior or bullying behavior or anything like that, controversies, it's decent, it's not too bad. For component 3, you just have to memorize your answers. What I did was I got an A in psych. So I literally, well, my teacher encouraged, thank you so much Rebecca, she encouraged us to create answer structures for every single possible answer. You don't have photographic memory, so you might not memorize every single answer to the T. Luckily, the component 3 paper was absolutely perfect for me, except for the controversies question. But even then, I still got an A on it. I got an A on all of those. I think I got an A star in one paper. I'm not quite sure, but that's besides the point. I got an A star in controversies actually. Component 3, not controversies. Component 3. But if you do that, there's no possible way that you can fail. There's no possible way you can get lower than a B. Do you know what I mean? If you just have to maintain your composure. If you suffer from exam anxiety, be so incredibly focused that the anxiety goes away. If you think about, I have an exam coming up, you'll get anxious, and then your thought process distracts from it. But if you just focus on memorizing, even when you're walking to the exam hall, don't speak to anyone. Don't speak to anyone. If anybody tries speaking to you, just say, listen, I'm focusing, I've got my exam. Because that 5-minute conversation, it can happen after your exam. But your grade might cost you an entire year or the university that you want to go to. So when you get to the exam, you have to just carry on in your mind, revising, consolidate in your mind, everything that you can possibly say. To be honest, for component 3, because it's so large, that might cause biases in your memory. So it might cause you memory loss, but that's down to you, and that's down to genuinely you, because you know how you function, you know how your memory works, you know how you revise type thing. So yeah, obviously I apologize. The scientific states of psychology, it was a short one. It was the only one I didn't finish actually. But I think with your lesson notes you can probably do the rest. So yeah, thanks for watching. I'll catch you later.